guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm doing it back to back, so I'm going to be reading chapter 4 of Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis. Okay, let's get started. This chapter is called I Wrote in My Mind. I struck the board and cried, no more I will abroad. What shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines in life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as a store. That was written by Herbert. In January 1911, just turned 13, I set out with my brother to Wyvern. He for the college and I for our preparatory school, which we will call Chartres. Those began what may be called the classic period of our school days. The thing we both think of the first when boyhood is mentioned, the joint journeys back to school with a reluctant parting at Wyvern Station, the hilarious reunion at the same station for the joint journey home, were now the great structural pillars of each year. Growing maturity is marked by the increasing liberties we take with our traveling. At first, on being landed early in the morning at Liverpool, we took the next train south. Soon we learned what it was pleasanter to spend the whole morning in the lounge of the Lime Street Hotel with our magazines and cigarettes, and to proceed to Wyvern by an afternoon train which brought us there at the latest permitted moment. Soon too we gave up the magazines. We made the discovery, some people never make it, that real books can be taken on a journey, and that hours of golden reading can so be added to its other delights. It is important to acquire early in life the power of reading sense wherever you happen to be. I first read Tamburlaine while traveling from Lame to Belfast in a thunderstorm, and first read Browning's Paracelsus by a candle which went out and had to be relit whenever a big battery fired in a pit below me, which I think it did every 4 minutes at the night. The homeward journey was even more festal. It had an invariable routine. First, the supper at the restaurant. It was merely poached eggs and tea, but to us the tables of the gods. Then the visit to the old empire. There were still music halls in those days, and after that the journey to a landing stage, the sight of great famous ships and departure, and once more the blessed salts on our lips. The smoking was, of course, as my father would have said, superfluous. Not so the visit of the empire. He was no Puritan about such matters, and often a Saturday night would take us to Belfast Hippodrome. And I recognize now that I never had the taste for vaudeville, which he shared with my brother. At the time, I supposed myself to be enjoying the show, but I was mistaken. All those antics lie dead in my memory, and then incapable of rousing the least vibration, even the reminiscent pleasure, whereas the pain of sympathy and vicarious humiliation, which I felt when I turned failed, is still vivid. What I enjoyed was merely the et cetera of the show. bustle and the lights, the sense of having a night out, the good spirits of my father in this holiday mood, and above all, the admirable cold supper to which we came back at about 10 o'clock, for this was also a classical age of our domestic cookery, the age of one Annie Strahan. There were certain raised pies set on the table of which a modern English boy has no conception, and which even then would have astonished those who knew only the poor counterfeits sold in shops. Chartres, a tall white building further up the hill than the college, was a smallish school with less than 20 boarders, but it was quite unlike Oldie's. Here, indeed, my education really began. The headmaster, whom we call Tubbs, was a clever and patient teacher. Under him, I rapidly found my feet in Latin and English, and even began to be looked on as promising candidate for a scholarship at the college. The food was good, though of course we grumbled at it, and we were well cared for on the whole. I got on the wall with my school fellows, though we had our full share of those lifelong friendships and irreconcilable factions and deadly quarrels and final statements and glorious revolutions which made up so much of the life of a small boy, and in which I came out sometimes at the bottom and sometimes at the top. Wyvern itself healed my quarrel with England. The great blue plain below us and behind those green peaked hills, so mountainous in form and yet so manageably small in size, become almost at once my delight. And Wyvern Priority was the first building that I ever perceived to be beautiful, and at Chartres I made my first real friends. But there too something far more important happened to me. I ceased to be a Christian. The chronology of this disaster is a little vague, but I know for certain that it had not begun when I went there, and that the process was complete very shortly after I left. I will try to set down what I know of the conscious cause of what I suspect of an unconscious, most reluctantly venturing no blame, and tenderly as I would at need reveal some errors in my own mother. I must begin with my dear Miss C, the matron. No school ever had a better matron, more skilled in comforting to boys with sickness, or more cheery and compassionable to boys in health. She was one of the most selfless people I have ever known. We all loved her. I, the orphan, especially. Now it so happened that Miss C, who seemed old to me, was still in her spiritual immaturity, still hunting with the eagerness of a soul that had touch of an angelic quality in it. For a truth and a way of life, guides were even rarer than now. She was, as I should now put it, floundering in the maze of theosophy, Rosicrucianism, spiritualism, and the whole Anglo-American occultist tradition. Nothing was further from the intention than to destroy my faith. She could not tell me that the room in which she brought this candle was full of gunpowder. I had never heard of such things before, never except in my nightmare or a fairy tale conceived of spirits other than God and men. I had loved to read of strange sights and other worlds and unknown modes of being, slightest belief. Even the phantom dwarf had only flashed on my mind for a moment. It is a great mistake to suppose that children believe the things they imagine, and I, long familiar with the whole imaginary world of Animal Land in India, which I could not possibly believe in since I knew I was one of its creators, was as little likely as a child to make that mistake. But now, for the first time, there burst upon me the idea that there might be real marvels all about us, that the visible world might be only a curtain to conceal huge realms of uncharted by my very simple theology. And that started in me something with which, on and off, I have had plenty of trouble since. The desire for a preternatural, simply as such, the passion for the occult. Not everyone has this disease. Those who have will know what I mean. I once tried to describe it in a novel. It is a spiritual lust, and like the lust of the body, it has the fatal power of making everything else in the world seem uninteresting while it lasts. It is probably this passion, more even than the desire of power, which makes magicians. But the result of Miss C's conversation did not stop there. Little by little, unconsciously, unintentionally, she loosened the whole framework, blunted all the sharp edges of my belief. The vagueness, the merely speculative character of all this occultism began to spread, yes, and to spread deliciously, to the stem truth of the creed. The whole thing became a matter of speculation. I was soon, in the famous words, altering, I believe, to one does feel. And oh, the relief of it. Those moonlit nights in the dormitory at Belsen, faded far away from the tyrannous noon of revelation. I passed into the cool evening twilight of higher thought, where there was nothing to be obeyed and nothing to be believed except what was either comforting or exciting. I do not mean that Miss C did this. Better say that the enemy did this in me, taking occasion from things she innocently said. One reason why the enemy found this so easy was that, without knowing it, I was already desperately anxious to get rid of my religion, and that for a reason worth recording. By the sheer mistake, and I still believe it to have been an honest mistake in spiritual technique, I had rendered my private practice of that religion a quite intolerable burden. It came about in this way. Like everyone else, I had been told as a child that one must not only say one's prayers, but think about what one's saying accordingly. When at oldies I came to a serious belief, I tried to put it into practice. At first it seemed plain sailing, but soon the false conscious, St. Paul's law, Herbert's prattler, came into play. One had no sooner reached amen than it whispered, "Yes, but are you sure you were really thinking about what you said?" Then more subtly, "Were you, for example, thinking about it as well as you did last night?" The answer, for a reason I did not then understand, was nearly always no. "Very well," said the voice. "Hadn't you then better try it over again?" And one obeyed, but of course with no assurance that the the second attempt would be any better. To these nagging suggestions, my reaction was, on the whole, the most foolish I could have adopted. I set myself a standard. No clause of prayer that was allowed to pass muster unless it was accompanied by what I call a realization, by which I meant certain vividness of the imagination, of the affection. My nightly task was to produce by sheer willpower a phenomenon which willpower could never produce, which was so ill-defined. And I could never say this absolute confidence whether it had occurred, in which even when it did occur was our very mediocre spiritual value. If only someone had read to me old Walter Hilton's warning that we must never in prayer strive to exhort by mastery what God does not give. But no one did, and night after night, dizzy with desire for sleep and often a kind of despair, I endeavored to pump up my realization. The thing threatened to become an infinite regress. One began, of course, by praying for good realizations, but had the preliminary prayer itself been realized? This question, I think, I still had enough sense to dismiss. Otherwise, it might have been as difficult to begin my prayers as to end them. How it all came back, the cold oil cloth, the quarters shimming, the night slipping past, the sickening, hopeless weariness. This was the burden from which I belonged with soul and body to escape. It had already brought me to such a pass that the nightly torment it projected its gloom over the whole evening, and I dreaded bedtime as if I were a chronic sufferer from insomnia. Had I pursued the same road much further, I think I should have gone mad. This ludicrous burden of false duties in prayer provided, of course, an unconscious motive for wishing to shuffle off Christian faith, but about the same time, or a little later, conscious cause of doubt arose. One came from reading the classics, here especially in Virgil. One was presented with a mass of religious ideas, and all teachers and editors took it for granted from the outset that these religious ideas were sheer illusions. No one ever attempted to show in what sense Christianity fulfilled paganism, or paganism prefigured Christianity. The accepted position seemed to be that religious were normally a mere farrago of nonsense, though our own, by a fortunate exception, was exactly true. The other religions were not even explained in the earlier Christian fashion as the work of devils, that I might conceivably have been brought to believe. But the impression I got was that religion in general, though utterly false, was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder. In the midst of 1,000 such religions stood our own, and 1,000 at first labeled true. But on what grounds could I believe in this exception? It obviously was, in some general sense, the sense of the same kind of thing as all the rest. Why was it so differently treated? Need I, at any rate, continue to treat it differently? I was very anxious not to. In addition to this, and equally working against my faith, was in a deeply ingrained pessimism, a pessimism by that time much more of intellect than a temper. I was now by no means unhappy, but I had very definitely formed the opinion that the universe was, in the main, in a rather regrettable institution. I am well aware that some will feel disgust and some will laugh at the idea of a loutish, well-fed boy in an Eton collar passing and unfavorable judgment on the cosmos. They may be right in either reaction, but no more right because I wore an Eden color. They are forgetting what boyhood felt like from within. Dates are not so important as people believe. I fancy that most of those who think at all have done a great deal of thinking in the first 14 years. As to the source of my pessimism, the reader will remember, though in many ways most fortunate, yet I have very early in life met a great dismay. But I am now inclined to think that the seeds of pessimism were sown before my mother's death. Ridiculous as it may sound, I believe that the clumsiness of my hands was the root of the matter. How could this be? Not certainly that a child says, I can't cut a straight line with a pair of scissors. Therefore, the universe is evil. Childhood has no such power of generalization, and it's not to do it injustice so silly, nor did my clumsiness produce what I ordinarily call an inferiority complex. I was not comparing myself with other boys. My defeats occurred in solitude. What they really bred in me was deep and, of course, an articulate sense of resistance and opposition on the parts of inanimate things. Even that makes it too abstract and adult. Perhaps I had better call it a settled expectation that everything would do what you did not want it to do. Whatever you wanted to remain straight would bend. Whatever you tried to bend would fly back to straight. All knots which you wished to be firm would come untied. All knots you wanted to untie would remain firm. It is not possible to put into language without making it comic, and I have indeed no wish to see it now, except as something comic. But it is perhaps just these early experiences, which are so fugitive and to an adult so grotesque, that give the mind its earliest bias, its habitual sense of what is or is not plausible. There was another predisposing factor. Though the son of a prosperous man, a man by our present tax-ridden standards, almost incredibly comfortable and secure, I had ever since I could remember, and believed that adult life was to be an unremitting struggle, in which the best I could hope for was a void at workhouse by extreme exertion. My father's highly colored statements on such matters had sunk deeply into my mind, and I never thought to check them by the very obvious fact that most of the adults I actually most of the adults I actually knew seemed to be living very comfortable lives. I remember summing up what it took to be our destiny in conversation with my best friend and chartress by the formula term holidays till we leave school, and then work till we die. Even if I had been free from this delusion, I think I should still have seen grounds for pessimism. One's views, even at the age, are not wholly determined by one's own momentary situation. Even a boy can recognize that there is desert all around him, though he, for the nuance, sits in oasis. I was in my ineffective way, tender-hearted creature. Perhaps the most murderous feeling I can ever entertain were towards an undermaster at Chartres who forbade me to give to a beggar at the school gate. And to this, that my early reading, not only Wells, but Sir Robert Ball, had lodged very firmly in my imagination. The vastness and cold of space, the littleness of man. It is not strange that I should feel the universe to be menacing and unfriendly place. Several years before I read Lucretius, I felt the force of his argument, and it is surely the strongest of all for atheism. Nequaquam nobis divinitus esse paratam naram rerum tanta stat predita culpa. Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. You may ask how I combine this directly atheistical thought, this great argument from undesigned with my occultist fancies. I do not think I achieved any logical connection between them. They swayed me in different moods and had only this in common, that both made against Christianity, and so little by little, with fluctuations which I cannot now trace, I became an apostate, dropping my faith with no sense of loss, but with the greatest relief. My stay at Chartres lasted from the spring term of 1911 till the end of the summer term 1913, and as I have said, I cannot give an accurate chronology between those dates of my slow apostasy. In other respects, the period is divided into two. About halfway through it, as much loved undermaster and the even more loved matron left at the same time. From that date onwards, there was a sharp decline, not indeed in apparent happiness, but in solid good. Dear Miss C had been the occasion of much good to me, as well as of evil. For one thing, my awakening my affections. She had done something to defeat that anti-sentimental inhibition which my early experience had bred in me. Nor would I deny that in all her higher thought, disastrous though it made effect on me, there were elements of real and disinterested spirituality, which I benefited. Unfortunately, once her presence was withdrawn, the good effects were withered, and the bad ones remained. The change of masters was even more obviously for the worse. Syrah, as we called him, had been an admirable influence. He was what I would now describe as a wise madcap, a boisterous, boyish, hardy man, well able to keep his authority while yet mixing with us almost as one of ourselves, an untidy, rollicking man without a particle of affection. He communicated what I very much needed, a sense of the gusto with which life ought, wherever possible, to be taken. I fancy it was on a run with him in the sleet that I first discovered how bad weather it is to be treated as a rough joke, a romp. He was succeeded by a young gentleman just down from the university, whom we may call Pogo. Pogo was a very minor addition for a Saki, perhaps even a Woodhouse hero. Pogo was a wit. Pogo was a dressy man. Pogo was a man about town. Pogo was even a lad. After a week or so of hesitation, for his temper was uncertain, we fell at his feet and adored. Here was sophistication glossy all over, and dared one believe it, ready to impact sophistication to us. We became, at least, I became dressy. It was the age of the knot of spread ties with pins in them, of very low cut coats and trousers worn very high to show startling socks, and brogue shoes with immensely wide laces. Something of all this had already trickled to me from the college through my brother, who was now becoming sufficiently senior to aspire to notary. Pogo completed the process, a more pitiful ambition for a lout of an overgrown 14-year-old with a shilling a week pocket money could hardly be imagined. The more so since I am one of those of whom nature has laid the doom that whatever they buy and whatever they wear, they will always look as if they had come out of an old clothes shop. I cannot even now remember without embarrassment the concern that I then felt about pressing my trousers and filthy habit, plastering my hair with oil. A new element had entered my life, vulgarity. Up till now, I had committed nearly every other sin and folly within my power, but I had not yet been flashy. These hobble-the-toy fineries were, however, only a small part of our new sophistication. Pogo was a great theatrical authority. We soon knew all the latest songs. We soon knew all about the famous actresses at the age: Lily Elsie, Gertie Miller, Zena Dare. Pogo was a fund of information about their private lives. We learned from him all these latest jokes. Where we did not understand, he was ready to give us help. He explained many things. After a term of Pogo society, one had the feeling of being not 12 weeks, but 12 years old. How gratifying and how edifying it would be if I could trace to Pogo all my slips from virtue and wind up by pointing the moral. How much harm a loose-talking young man can do to innocent boys. Unfortunately, this would be false. It is quite true that at this time I underwent a violent and wholly successful assault of sexual temptation, but this is accounted for by the age I had then reached, and by my recent, in a sense, my deliberate withdrawal of myself from divine protection. I do not believe Pogo had anything to do with it. The facts of generation. I had learned long ago from another boy when I was too young to feel much more than his scientific interest in them. What attacked me through Pogo was not the flesh. I had that of my own, but the world, the desire for glitter, swagger, distinction of desire to be in the know. He gave little help, if any, in destroying my chastity, but he made sad work of certain humble and childlike and self-forgetful qualities which I think had remained with me till that moment. I began to labor very hard to make myself into a fop, a cad, and a snob. Pogo's communications, however much they helped to vulgarize my mind, had such electric effect on my senses as a dancing mistress, nor as beggars' charicles, which was given me for a price. I never thought that dancing mistress as beautiful as my cousin G, but she was the first woman I ever looked upon to lust after her. Assuredly, through no fault of her own, a gesture, a tone of the voice made in these matters have unpredictable results. When the schoolroom on the last night of the winter term was decorated for a dance, she paused, lifted a flag, and remarking, "I love the smell of bunting," pressed it to her face, and was undone. And I was undone. You must not suppose that this was a romantic passion. The passion of my life, as the next chapter will show, belonged to a wholly different region. What I felt for her dancing mistress was sheer appetite, the prose and not the poetry of the flesh. I did not feel at all like a knight devoting himself to a lady. I was more like a Turk looking at a Circassian whom he could not afford to buy. I knew quite well what I wanted. It is common, by the way, to assume and such an experience produce a feeling of guilt, but it did not do so in me. And I may as well say here that the feeling of guilt, save were a moral offense, happened also to break the code of honor, or had consequences which excited my pity, was a thing which at that time I hardly knew. It took me as long as to acquire inhibitions as others, they say, have taken to get rid of them. That is why I often find myself at such cross purposes with the modern world. I have been converted pagan, living among apostate Puritans. I would be sorry if the reader passed too harsh a judgment on Pogo, as I now see it. He is not too old to have charge of boys, but too young. He was only an adolescent himself, still immature enough to be delightfully grown up and naive enough to enjoy our greater naivete. And there was a real friendliness in him. He was moved partly by that to tell us all he knew or thought he knew. And now, as Herodotus would say, goodbye to Pogo. Meanwhile, side by side with my loss of faith, of virtue, and of the simplicity, something quite different was going on. It will demand a new chapter. Okay, that was the end of chapter 4. Chapter 4. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. Give me a thumbs up, share, comment. Follow me on Instagram. Hit the bell for notifications, and I will talk